I hope everyone had a great lunch. My name is Bill Menarche, and I'm the Vice President of Federal Business at Data Direct Networks. And, I'd like to thank Deltec for putting on this great event. So very excited to be here. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to introduce our next speaker. The Government Cloud Initiative is something that's very near and dear to Data Direct Networks. The shift to cloud is absolutely going to be a seismic shift in the way that we manage information, and one that I think is going to have an incredible impact on the way the federal government does business, how it operates, and by extension, what the benefit will be to the citizens of the United States. We thought it was really a perfect fit for us to be able to host this event. Data Direct Networks, we're the world's largest privately held storage company. We focus on solving complex file system, infrastructure, and I/O challenges for many different customers. And, again, helping organizations maximize their information. And to me, that's what cloud is really all about. We talk about cloud efficiency, and we're not just talking about improved utilization of assets. We're really talking about greater utility of the data, getting the most out of that data, making better decisions with that data, and doing it within an infrastructure that improves efficiency and ultimately lowers cost. So with that being said, thank you, Deltec. And it's been a great event so far. I'm looking forward to hearing the speakers this afternoon. And with that said, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Don Leaf is Senior Executive for Cloud Computing at the National Institutes of Science and Technology. And today we found out that Dawn was recognized as one of the top women in cloud computing in America, as recognized by an organization named Cloud Now, which is a consortia of both private and public organizations. So Dawn, thank you.
So good afternoon. I'm honored to be asked to join you today to talk about cloud computing. It's always an honor to be asked to share your opinions and perspectives. It's especially an honor that people actually stayed after lunch. And it's also an honor because it's the second time that I've been invited to speak at CloudGov. And to me, there's an analogy there. You don't really know somebody until you work for him or her. So if you do it voluntarily a second time, you know what you're getting into. And in this case, I've been invited to speak to you again, and I'm flattered and honored that CloudGov felt that I was able to do that a second time. Gives me an opportunity to revisit where we are now and where we were a year ago with respect to the NIST Cloud Computing Program, initiative to build a U.S. government cloud computing roadmap, and our collaboration effort, which is really the main thing I want to talk to you about today. So last year, I talked about how, at least from my perspective, cloud computing collaboration between academia, industry, standards bodies, government, is sort of like the Wizard of Oz story, right? We know where we want to get to. It's not exactly a straight shot. It's iterative, it's incremental. We have lots of different interests, lots of different skill sets, and we're working together to try to achieve those objectives. And besides, I thought the pictures would liven things up a little bit. Just to revisit, how many people were here last year? Okay, so our goal hasn't changed. NIST has a technology leadership role that has been defined in the U.S. government federal cloud computing strategy that was issued by the United States Chief Information Officer in February of 2011. And part of our objectives are to help U.S. government agencies do what they need to do to migrate their IT services, $20 billion of that annual expenditure out of the total $80 billion-dollar annual expenditure to the cloud model, with the goal being to reduce costs and improve services. And very specifically, our job at NIST is to help identify high-priority interoperability, portability, and security requirements that have to be met for U.S. government agencies to more aggressively deploy cloud, to accelerate their deployment. And I heard earlier today some of the panelists were talking about the movement from the commodity IT cloud services into supporting core mission space. And of course, that's the ultimate objective. NIST is also working to identify the standards, guidance, and technology that needs to be in place to satisfy those requirements. And the mechanism that we have now used, we're not just using it, we have used to define and communicate those priorities, is the U.S. Government Cloud Computing Technology Roadmap, which was issued for public comment in November 2011. And I want to make the point here that the work that supports the roadmap, that wasn't an internal NIST effort. That was truly done collaboratively. We had 5 public working groups. Each working group had between 300 and 500 registered members. Although, as you might expect with a working group, that means you have a relatively smaller percentage who are actually directly contributing. And we had outreach events where we had over 500 people registered for each one to calibrate our efforts. And just to provide some context, this is what it looked like from a timeline perspective. So we launched the effort at or around November 2010. We developed a strategy, 3-part strategy, that included identifying the hard spots in U.S. government agency deployment of cloud, working with industry to define a reference architecture that's neutral, not tied to a particular implementation, so that U.S. government agencies and others can compare cloud services apples to apples, and then exercising scenarios from those mission use cases against existing cloud services to identify the hard spots: interoperability, portability, security. So these are the 10 hard spots listed. And when you first look at this list, you might say, well, gee, that's just a technical list. That's clearly something that NIST would project. But actually, there are very practical reasons behind each of these 10 high-priority requirements that directly relate to what's going on right now with cloud. So if we just look at the first one, International Voluntary Consensus-Based Standards for Interoperability, Portability, Security in Cloud. Strategically, we know that's important because for U.S. industry to compete globally on a level playing field, we need to have an agreement internationally on what the standards are, because we don't need to build different products for different countries, and we want to provide services globally. Strategically, it's important to us as taxpayers, because if we're going to make big investments in a technology like cloud computing, we don't want those investments to become prematurely technologically obsolete because of standards changes. But on a real practical level, we need these standards in place and under development right now to address some of the concerns and issues that were raised earlier. So in the case of all these requirements, it's not a matter of if you can or not satisfy them at all. It's not black and white. The question is, can you satisfy them to the degree you need to? So in terms of data portability and services portability, like VM portability, it is possible to port data and services and VMs from one cloud provider to another. It's not easy. You have to pull it out of the cloud, you have to reformat it in some cases to a proprietary format, and then move it to a different provider's environment. Can't do it seamlessly with a single management command. And I can say this with some confidence because I was at Cloud Connect just this week, and I talked to a lot of the integrators in the cloud space, a lot of those who are trying to deploy new applications on the cloud space or provide services to migrate organizations and cloud consumers from one provider to another. And they reinforce the fact that this requirement is not sufficiently met. And I won't go over all these in detail. You can go to the NIST website, and it explains, I think, pretty clearly as to why each of these is important from a practicality perspective. But I will point out just one more, number 9, reliability design goals. There's been a lot of press whenever we lose a cloud provider's services, and that's happened several times over the past couple of years. What we sometimes don't think about is how reliability and performance is achieved in a cloud environment. It's not like when you have dedicated machines for systems and you just can increase the components to avoid single points of failure and improve your reliability that way. Cloud is implemented differently. It's very much done from a soft perspective. So we need to rethink those design goals. It's not just a matter of signing up for a service level agreement that gets you a certain performance and reliability level. There needs to be technology development to support that. And in the public comments we've received, no one has disagreed with any of these requirements. There's opinions on how to pursue it. There's opinions on the relative degree to which they're satisfied. But basically, we have a roadmap now. We know where we're going. And that work is supported through the technical work that was completed over the last year. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but it's all on the website if you want to look and see the technical foundation supporting the assertion that these are high priority requirements. What's really important is where do we go from here? So from our perspective, our observations, we're now in the trenches. Okay, so we had the plan, we have the roadmap, we have the strategic objectives, and we're in that really messy period. And I don't mean in any way to trivialize real warfare, okay? This isn't a life or death situation, but there is an analogy in the sense that you start out with a plan that you're executing, and you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we're in an evolving technology space. We have a lot of people working together, and sometimes not together, but certainly in parallel to achieve an overall objective, which is to move forward in cloud, to do it effectively and securely. And what I want to talk about just very briefly is one way that we can move forward together more collaboratively and to try to leverage our work. So we still have the same strategy, and I heard several people earlier today reinforce the need to identify mission cases, to define your specific requirements for cloud, to make sure they're met. We, of course, can move that forward with different tactical efforts, but there's another thing we can do. And that is through what we call the concept of priority action plans, just figuring out what everybody is already working on in the space that's related, to avoid duplicating our effort, to truly leverage our effort. So if I were to make a call today to you as fellow collaborators in cloud, it would be, look at those 10 requirements. If you've got a solution already, we'd love to hear about it. And what we will do in turn is to help make that known, to make it available, to provide opportunities to explore that, to provide proof of concept, to validate it. There are some that we know about. We know Carnegie Mellon is working on specifications for cloud, technical specifications and metrics. We know UMBC is working on security aspects in cloud and security solutions. We know that the European Commission and the Japanese government have their own roadmaps with respect to cloud that approach many of the same requirements that we have here in the US. We know that the industry is working on mapping their services to the reference architecture to try to help us find those holes, and that some partners like the Business Software Alliance, Tech America, this organization represented here, CSA, they're all working on their individual products that relate to the overall cloud services. But it's a huge field. So there's a whole lot that we don't know that we need to leverage. In the meantime, there are some very practical things we can do with respect to interoperability, portability, security standards. Okay, they're not in place now, and there's some discussion, differences of opinion as to how soon you establish those, depending on where you think we are in the technology evolution cycle. But certainly, in our service level agreements now, we can ask the vendors to demonstrate they're portable. Let's ask them to demonstrate how we move from one environment to another. If not truly from a full-scale production perspective, at least from a modeling perspective. If we look at trying to understand and compare cloud services, and another thing I noticed at Cloud Connect is that it's just exploding. There are tremendous entries into the cloud services and cloud integration space now. We can ask those vendors to map their services to something like the NIST reference architecture, which is being reviewed by the International Standards Organization, but it doesn't have to be that one, to a common reference framework so we can more easily compare, and so we don't have to read everybody's literature and try to figure it out for ourselves. We can also define our unique requirements. With US government deployment, there's a lot of focus on security. There's definitely a need to move from a traditional reliance on logical and physical system boundaries for certification and security controls, but that's not the only one. We very often forget about 508 compliance, the need to be able to provide services to those who have disabilities. And cloud is a tremendous opportunity there because of its platform independence and its end-user device independence and the ability to define profiles, not just for those with disabilities, but for the average user, so that as we're using different services, we don't have to figure out how to do it uniquely each time we access the services. Another thing that I want to touch on very briefly is another tactical step that we can take, and that is looking at the deployment models, whether it's not only private and public, we focus on that a lot, but community and hybrid, and the service models, infrastructure, software, and platform, and match those up against our mission. And especially having been at NIST actually only 2 years and having come from an operational perspective like many of you and from industry, I think it's very important that the guidance we provide isn't just based on theory, but from a practical sense. Those of us who are actually deploying cloud, those in industry who are building the solutions. And this is where we want to make sure the guidance that we provide, and this will be our 3rd volume in the roadmap, is really based on that realistic, practical perspective. This is the timeline. I won't, again, spend a lot of time on it. You can see all the publications that we issued prior to November 2011. You can see what we're planning to issue and will be available on the website in 2012. And of course, we'll update the roadmap at or around the end of this fiscal year. We have another Cloud Computing Forum scheduled June 5th through the 7th. It'll be at the Department of Commerce downtown, which will make it a little easier for people in Virginia and in the DC area to attend. And when we hold them in Gaithersburg, I encourage you by all means to keep track on the site and to register and participate. And that's pretty much what I had. I thank you very much for your patience. Are there any questions? Going once? Twice? Okay, there's one.
Thank you. My name is Bob Farron. I'm with USCIS. I'm always interested in this point of view because I participated in a number of ANSI and other standard setting processes. And one of the concerns that I usually have is that there's not a box for change. In other words, you put a standard in place and everybody locks to it. And what I'm asking is, where in this strategy is there a box for reevaluation, continuous improvement, and change?
Okay, so that first requirement on the list, international consensus-based standards, assumes as is appropriate, that standards from the U.S. government perspective are developed in the private sector. They are evolving even as we speak. The expectation is they will continue to evolve, and I'll just focus on a couple of specific examples to answer your question. So in, I want to say September 2011, NIST issued a reference architecture that, as I mentioned, was based not just on NIST work, but a tremendous amount of work from the private sector, and went through, I want to say, 13 internal revisions before it went out as a special pub. And it is currently, even as we speak, under review with the ISO and with other standards organizations who are reviewing it and revising it. And our expectation is that as the technology evolves, that standard will evolve. And to give you just one very specific example that's controversial, it's the role of cloud broker. Those who participated in the public working group at NIST felt very strongly that this was a very valid role, not just from an organization brokering cloud services, but from automated brokering of cloud services. There are some who are offended by the word broker because they think it sounds, well, they just think it implies a value judgment about that function. And that was under debate within the US, and sure enough, when we went to the international community, they took the position that you absolutely have to have the broker role. And when we talked to the Federal Standards and Technology Working Group, which has the US government agencies, they absolutely want a broker role because they want to know what a broker is. So that's a real live example of exactly what you're talking about, and that will continue, and we'll just see it in different versions. Any other questions?
You sort of answered part of my question in that you want to wait and see what the best practices are developed by industry, and then you come along and create standards that we can at least map what the solutions are. Is there a means to sort of provide boilerplate, RFP language, things like that to say, here's what you can ask for, maybe not from NIST, but somebody, and then also find a way to develop an ongoing relationship where, my brain just went blank, where there's a way to assess that a innovation is something that is good so that it actually breeds competition as opposed to everybody looking the same.
Okay, a couple of things there. Just for the record, in the US, we NIST don't create standards. We support development by the private sector. Part of the way I would address that question, this is sort of throwing out the gauntlet, a challenge to industry, is that in advance of the reference architecture I mentioned becoming an ISO standard, we in the government, we don't have time to wait. Okay, so we're asking industry to map their products right now, full knowing that the eventual definition of the reference architecture is going to evolve, for instance, as the security architecture evolves. So we believe that you need to take tactical steps in the meantime while you're developing these strategic overall standards. To your point, real quick about SLAs, there are several efforts related to SLA. There's a technical working group that NIST supports and sponsors within the US government to define the technical requirements for SLAs. It's one of the requirements in our top 10 list, where we're encouraging industry to help define the technical specifications for cloud SLAs, because you don't measure them the same way you do traditional services. And that is coordinated very closely. I don't know if Dave McClure mentioned it this morning, but with the policy guidance that's being developed at the federal level.
So a follow-up question for the, as you go forward, looking at not just understanding, you do guidelines based on standards. So an organization like Cloud Security Alliance that's developing best practices that are becoming standards as well, what's the give and take relationship between NIST and those kinds of organizations so that you can provide content to people who need it today, not waiting for standards, okay, so but also develop over time?
That's a really easy one. Okay, because when NIST developed its original reference architecture collaboratively, we looked at 13 that were out there, one of which was CSA. And the CSA reference architecture, for example, as you would expect, was based on the knowledge base of its industry members, right? They know their products, they know their solutions. So that was an initial give. CSA members not only participate in the working groups and in the forums, but actually in the working groups, including the security working group, which is a public group, and the reference architecture group. And now we've taken it a step further. Since you do have a broad representation in CSA of security vendors related to cloud, they've actually, and it's through the Washington chapter, and I forget the exact date, but they have accepted an action item to help flesh out the security architecture piece of the reference architecture. And then the way that'll work is we're neutral. Okay? We need to maintain that broad perspective on behalf of the taxpayer and industry and a level playing field. So NIST will assess that to ensure that there is not inherent bias in what's proposed from CSA, but leverage their expertise. So it's really cyclical.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a bit about that forum. I went to the last forum and found it quite valuable, so I was wondering if you could sort of sell it a bit better to this crowd. Why should we go to the forum? How much does it cost? Who's invited?
Thank you. And I did not ask this gentleman to ask that, just for the record. First of all, the NIST forums and workshops are free. Sounds good. We pride ourselves on that because the goal is to make it accessible to everyone. That means that we don't provide much in the way of, I'd say, like coffee and tea and refreshments and that sort of thing, because obviously we need to watch our costs. And we're very reluctant to take on sponsors because we don't want it to look like there's undue influence, although, of course, there's not. We make sure that we get really subject matter experts in the field. We have always our Undersecretary, Pat Gallagher, and the United States CIO open up those events. We make sure that we have academia, industry, and a nice mix of technical work and of strategic viewpoints through panels. We update our own work, and I think, to your point, the most valuable piece is actually the workshop. When we get feedback, and this is the third day of the event, this is where we break up into small groups and you go into your interest areas, whether it's security or mission use cases or SLAs, and we have a short, like a 2 to 3 hour session where we actually do work collaboratively on site and not just talk about cloud. So we very much hope that everybody here comes to the June one. Thank you. All right, well, yes?
Somewhere. Sorry.
I was just wondering if configuration management was on your list of priorities. I heard SLAs, but just curious in terms of configuration management.
That's also an interesting topic, truly, because you still have configuration management in all IT services. It may be done differently in a cloud model. There are aspects of configuration management that, of course, apply directly to security controls and implementation. The characteristics of cloud that give it its strength, the ability to access from an end user perspective through a broad variety of devices and networks that are not previously defined, co-tenancy, elasticity, utility, provision, may change the way you approach configuration management. It's the same as with security. So what you do is you don't want to solve the whole broad spectrum of IT solutions through the cloud model. That's not appropriate. You have to figure out what the unique aspects are. And I think the best place to focus on for that is this public security working group. All right. Well, again, I thank you very much for your patience, and I hope that you'll come to our event in June.